Hello and welcome to CompuScholar's Teacher Professional Development Series for October 2018. Today we're going to be talking about how to write great comments in your code. First, some quick introductions. My name is Chris Youst. I'm the president of CompuScholar. I've spent many years writing code for a variety of large and small companies, and also many years in the education space as well. We'd love to hear from you after the webinar, so you're always welcome to reach out to me with questions and comments at chris.youst@compuscholar.com. Today we're going to be covering a few different topics regarding code comments. First, we'll talk about why you'd want to comment your code at all, and then we'll touch lightly on some specific considerations for students in classrooms, as well as reasoning behind doing this at a professional level. And finally, we'll end with a variety of examples from our own student work that show some good and bad comments. Okay, so as you might expect, probably the number one reason why you might want to add comments to your code is so that you can remember what you're doing later. It's not uncommon for you as a software engineer or a student or a hobbyist to write so much code that a few days, weeks, or months later, you look back and you have no idea what you were doing. So comments are a great help to remind you of what you were thinking. Similarly, it's very likely that other folks are going to be looking at your code as well, whether it's a teacher or a colleague or another professional or somebody in a different company. It's really a good idea to give them some idea of what you're doing. So adding clear comments to your code is a great way to help other people know what you were thinking. Of course, you'll want to focus your comments on areas of code that are maybe a little bit trickier than others, or that are there for some non-obvious reasons. So as you'll see when we get to the examples, you don't necessarily need to comment every single line of code if it's obvious what you're doing, but you will want to add some very clear comments about things that are not obvious to the casual reader. We'll also show you an example of automatic help and reference documentation that can be generated from your comments in the code. And these types of comments are very helpful in certain situations. And of course, you might have a number of other important reasons why you want to comment your code as well. So if you're a teacher in a classroom, you most likely will be faced with a number of different student files that are being submitted to you. So it's usually a good idea to have students add comments to the top of your code that describe the class that they're in, the activity that they're working on, their name and their date, and so on. So you might have your own standards for this, but this is something that we've seen that's pretty common and we encourage in our own students. One other thing we wanted to mention from a classroom consideration is that student projects tend to look very much alike in a lot of cases, especially in early projects in the semester when the students are just getting started. There's only so many ways that you can write Hello World and other types of simple applications. So if you are doing manual grading, or you have an automatic grader of some sort that's scanning the code and trying to assign a grade, you might find cases where the actual code part looks suspiciously identical. And is this a plagiarism case? Is it simply a case of students coming up with the same thing based on some very specific instructions? Sometimes it's hard to tell from the code alone. However, if you are encouraging or requiring student comments in the code, then it is less likely that those student comments will end up appearing the same. So students may tend to comment things differently, even if they're writing the same code, and this will give you a higher degree of confidence that students are actually doing their own work. Now, comments are super important in professional settings as well. So imagine that you're at a software company and someone there at the company has written many lines of code, and right before some sort of important deadline, that person gets hired away by Google or some other big company, and you are asked to step in by the boss and finish what they're doing. So you're faced with thousands of lines of code. You may or may not have any idea what's going on, and this is a challenge for you. So the person might have left behind some requirements documentation, they might have left behind some design documentation, but in many cases the actual details of why they're doing certain things are, if anywhere, kept in the code comments. So it's very difficult to take over a project if you're taking over many lines of code that have no useful comments in them at all. A lot of times the code doesn't exactly match the design docs or the requirements, and so having those comments in the code is important for the company. So companies will often have some sort of standards for comments in their code, either some formal guidelines or at least some informal expectations. And it is certainly true that other software engineers will be looking at your code, and if they don't like what they see, they're going to probably think less of you as a software engineer. So making your code function correctly is important. Making your code look good from a Whitespace and a formatting perspective is important, and adding those useful comments into the code so that people can follow what you're doing. All of those things will reflect on you as a software engineer. So you want to get in the habit early of writing good comments and carry that through into your professional career. All right, let's go through a number of examples of comments that are maybe good or bad. And the first thing that I wanted to point out is that it's possible to write comments that don't really mean anything, or that they don't add value. So if you're looking at a line of code, for example, here we're just adding 1 to the number of gumdrops as a variable. Writing that out as a comment to the side really doesn't help anybody, because it's obvious from the code what's going on already. So how could you make that better? You might rephrase that in a way that tells you why you're doing it. So we're going to increase this number by 1 when a certain event happens. So giving some context to what's going on, if you want to comment a line of code that's by itself pretty obvious, is usually the better way to go. Here's another example, again taken from student work in one of our courses. So the student has written a method called wake up that's present on an object called dog. And so someone has obviously told the student, you need to write comments everywhere. And so the student has dutifully written comments everywhere. But if you look at them, it really doesn't tell you anything beyond the code itself. So this method wakes the dog up as a description for the public wake up method. It doesn't really tell you what the method does in detail. And if you look at the individual comments here off to the right, prints a message to the screen. Well, we all know that already. Sets the value of sleeping to false. Again, they're just repeating what the code is telling you without adding any value here, and so on. So you might see students do this just because they're forced to add comments to every line of code and they're not thinking too hard, but they're really not all that useful. Here's a better way to write the comments, where you're actually adding a little bit of value here to the person that's reading it. So your comment regarding the nature of the function itself, when a dog wakes up, we want to print a message and reset the properties that belong to the dog on a daily basis. So that gives you some idea what to expect as you start reading the function. Now again, we've left comments on every line here, even though that might be overkill, but we've at least rephrased them so that we're giving a little bit more context. The reason that we're printing out this message to the screen is that it's required status output. The reason that we're setting this flag to false is to note that the dog is no longer sleeping. And based on our system requirements, every time the dog wakes up, we're going to assume the dog's not been fed. So that's why we're setting the number of times fed equal to 0. So these kinds of comments give you a little bit more context and feel for what's actually going on, as opposed to just repeating what the code is already telling you. Now, as I mentioned, it's certainly possible to add too many comments, or comments that are too long, to your code, and this actually makes it harder to read because people have to wade through a lot of stuff just to get to the heart of the matter. So this is an example constructor function where a race car object is being initialized, and the student has written a 2-line comment here to describe what the constructor is doing, and then comments again on every line just to restate the obvious that we're taking these input parameters and initializing the class member variables. So really this is overkill. It doesn't really add a lot of value to what's going on. So how can we do this better? So to do this better, we keep our comments shorter and to the point at the top. If we feel like some lines of code are so obvious they need no comments, just leave some comments out. Again, it's probably a common mistake to require students or other engineers to comment every line of code. That's generally not needed. You want to save your comments for cases like we have here at the bottom, where we say, for this last initialization, we're giving some context to why we're setting this current speed equal to 0, as opposed to initializing it to some other value. So again, this is a bit of an art form, and you might well find folks that are really enthusiastic on one side of the debate about how much comments are the right amount. But again, you're not necessarily required to comment every line of code. You want to comment the things that are interesting and be brief enough about it that it doesn't really distract from the code. Here's another example that uses a race car object, and this is an accelerate method. So what we've done up top is we've very briefly stated what the method is going to do. It's going to increase the race car speed, and oh, by the way, this method is actually required by some other interface. So we're given a couple of key pieces of information here up at the top of the function. And then you'll notice the function itself, we do a little bit of math, we do some logic, we set some new speeds, but the comments in green here are describing in English, or at least in plain language, what is the intent of these lines of code. So instead of the reader trying to figure out what is my current speed plus equal my acceleration, what is the purpose of that, you can read it here in English right above. Accelerating means we're going to increase the current speed by the acceleration value. and so hopefully your comment actually accurately reflects what's going on in that line of code. So it's usually a good idea to write out your algorithm, so to speak, or your pseudocode in English, and then you can implement that in the syntax of the language right underneath. Here's another bit of advice that maybe you won't hear in a lot of other places. In my personal and professional experience, the use of Whitespace is super important to make comments easy to read. So it's not uncommon to see students that write comments just by adding a single space at the end of the line, and then you see comments kind of spread left to right horizontally, and it's actually kind of hard to read this if you're just moving fast and you want to skim through the code. So how would you use Whitespace in a little bit more productive manner? Here we've simply indented all of our comments in equal amount to the right, and then that way it's easier for us as the reader to simply skim top to bottom and see what's going on in each line, so our eyes don't have to bounce back and forth left to right. So again, just make good use of Whitespace in your comments, make your code nice and neat and easy to read, and that will be helpful for everyone. Something else that I personally am a big fan of, and that is providing some references in the comments to external documentation. So if you're writing a line of code here, and you can see we're making a function call with some parameters, in addition to describing what the function does, you can reference some external documentation for the reasoning and motivation behind it. So this might be a link to a design document or a web page somewhere where we're describing a protocol, and often that's much more productive than copying and pasting in reams and reams of information directly into the source code. So I love to see links here to external documents where the reasoning and motivation, or at least some background, is provided for the code that's being written. So the last thing I wanted to mention is that sometimes comments are written specifically for these autodoc tools. So you can write specially formatted comments within your code and then run an external tool that will look through your source file, gather up all those special comments, and auto-generate some sort of reference documentation, typically in HTML format. So you would often want to do this if the code that you're writing is going to be part of an API or an SDK or some other sort of public or internally consumable object that will be reused by others. And a very common tool in the Java language is JavaDoc, so let's take a quick look at that. Okay, here we're looking at a source file called showtime.java, and this has got a few basic JavaDoc comments in it. You can see a header up here that has the multi-line comment with some extra asterisks in here, as well as the ampersand to mark certain keywords, and a little bit of HTML formatting to guide the output as well. So this is a kind of a common header. You can document each function within the class the same way, again describing the parameters that are coming in, and then individual comments obviously as normal. So once you're done with this kind of comment, you can run the JavaDoc external tool and then produce some useful results. So here's actually the output of those JavaDoc comments. This is an HTML page that describes all the classes in the package. You've got the Showtime class here, and you can see the comments that we added at the top, as well as a list of all the functions. You can click on a function, and here you can see the comment that we used to describe that function, as well as the arguments and so forth to that function. So JavaDoc and tools like that in other languages are pretty handy and used very regularly in cases where this sort of documentation is appropriate. So we do introduce our students to this where appropriate, and it's something that you want to be aware of as you generate your own documentation and your own comments, as well as look at these types of auto-generated reference tools from others. Okay, so to summarize what we're talking about today, in order to write great code comments, you want to avoid obvious comments that don't really add any value or insight to the line of code or to the function that you're commenting. You really shouldn't feel like you have to comment every single line of code, and that's probably something you want to avoid mandating for your students as well. When you do write code, go ahead and explain what you're doing in plain language that's easy to understand. Make sure you use Whitespace and other types of formatting so that your comments are actually easy to read. If you have a handy link or something that can provide some more background information on why you're doing what you're doing, those are great things to leave in the code comments as well. And then finally, when it's appropriate, make sure you understand and use the comment formats so that an auto documentation tool can come along behind you and generate some reference information. So these are just a few of the tips that I've picked up in my own personal experience. Thanks so much for watching today. We're always happy to chat about the contents of this webinar, and we'd love to hear your feedback and suggestions for other webinars as well. So again, don't be bashful about emailing me directly or giving us a call or visiting us on our website. Thanks for watching.